Chapter 14. Beyond Clairvoyance, Lucidity. If there was nothing more beyond what has been examined so far, then this book would constitute not much more than a special historical treatment of human sensing factors and sexualizing energies rejected by the modernist mainstream sciences and philosophies of the cultural West. But there is something more, a factor so ultra-strange that it has taken the first half of this book to erect a reality approach to it. The ultra-strange factor is identified as lucidity, and this and the next 4 chapters will be required to provide adequate background materials in order to flesh it out. Definitions of lucidity. Lucid is an adjective and means suffused with light, luminous, brightness, translucent, having full use of one's faculties, sane, and clear to the understanding. Lucidity is a noun. 2 definitions of it are found in Webster's, the first given as clearness of thought or style, and in this sense it is a completely acceptable word even within mainstream workings. Its second established definition, however, might come as a surprise and, all things considered, even as somewhat of a shock. The capacity to perceive the truth directly and instantaneously. Clairvoyance. It is the background history of this second definition that must now be examined for 2 reasons. First, lucidity is not merely clairvoyance, but a super format of it, and so the definition above does little to enlighten very much. Second, there is a very big story involved, and which has many complicated aspects. However, any real appreciation of the lucidity story must begin by making an attempt to bring at least a modicum of authenticity to clairvoyance itself as a necessary human attribute. The absolute necessity of clairvoyant faculties. The general list of this and the next 4 chapters can be brought to light via the following brief discussion having to do with the necessity of clairvoyant faculties that enable perception of invisible factors, energies, and forces. We can get into this by posing an important and larger picture question about what is actually needed for best chance and optimum human survival. If one takes enough time to assess the fundamental attributes human organisms need for best chance survival, those attributes, in the bigger picture, will be seen as twofold. The absolute necessity of sensing the visible, tangible, and the invisible, intangible. There is a simple computation involved that helps erect the needed reality here. If one can't sense the invisible, one stands a very good chance of getting clobbered by it. This does not aid in survival, and there is a fair amount of historical documentation to back this up. Give or take a little, this simple computation was more or less understood as real by most societies up until the time the modern mainstream sciences went materialistic only. The event, formulated at about 1845, erected the 5 physical senses only paradigm, and whose assumed authenticity thereafter required the deconstruction of clairvoyant faculties that could sense the invisible. It is abundantly true that the 5 physical senses alone can usually go a long way toward survival, although what survival is considered to consist of has some bearing on this. But the 5 physical senses alone can often be quite notoriously inadequate when, for example, it comes to such matters as foreseeing what is going to happen and when it will. Since antiquity, this foreseeing activity has been the principal role in all pre-modern cultures for clairvoyance under any format or name. But in the sense of this small discussion, the consideration is not between the 5 physical senses and clairvoyance and various pro and con attitudes regarding them, but more pointedly between sensing both the invisible and the visible. Thus, all human organisms are naturally endowed with clairvoyant sensing faculties, and this is the principal reason they keep emerging down through the generations in spite of any societal resistance to them. It might be added that the modern sentiments against clairvoyance have made such an illogical mess of this that it's of little wonder that the simple factors occluded within it are difficult to perceive. Thus, if it can be stipulated that the human organism is naturally endowed in some way to sense invisibles, then the concept of clairvoyance is authentic. However, such natural endowments will fall into certain characteristics in respect of all natural endowments. Generally speaking, it is broadly understood that all natural endowments are only of potential nature, and it is understood as well, and as such, the potentials need to be actively nurtured, focused, honed, and somehow perfected if they are to achieve any kind of optimum efficiency. The distinction between natural clairvoyant faculties and lucidity is that the latter comes into functioning only if methods of artificial enhancement are undertaken. The story of lucidity is therefore the tale of one such enhancement procedure. To begin the strange story of lucidity. The story of lucidity begins as follows. The nature of clairvoyance and other energetic sensing principles are found itemized and explained in ancient Eastern sources. During the latter half of the 19th century, these were investigated by a number of Westerners, some of whom had the enthusiastic idea of activating their own extended perceptual powers, more or less based on the ancient Eastern knowledge routes. And among those Westerners, we now encounter a particular individual. I will introduce him in the following way. In antiquity, there was a time when it could be said that all roads led to Rome, and in much the same way, it can be said that all roads regarding modern concepts of the aura and clairvoyance lead back to the clairvoyant superpowers of one rather startling individual named Charles Webster Leadbeater. Leadbeater was such a complex, larger-than-life figure that his personality and psychology will probably never be sorted out. Thus, there are many approaches to introducing and discussing his cultural shaping impacts. Here, however, we are principally interested only in his clairvoyant faculties, and so first and foremost, it is important to determine if his clairvoyant superpowers were authentic, and there is some startling but compelling evidence in this regard. Charles Webster Leadbeater, clairvoyant superstar. Charles Webster Leadbeater, 1854 to 1934, began his active life as a British clergyman, but soon joined the Theosophical Society in which he was to play a prominent part. He established a close working relationship with Annie Besant, 1847 to 1933, another prominent theosophist and eventual successor of Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the original power founder of theosophy. It is apparent that Besant was no mean clairvoyant herself, but evidence relative to her faculties is not as clear-cut. The headquarters of the World Theosophical Movement was in Adyar, India. During the years just preceding 1908, Leadbeater and Besant teamed up to utilize microclairvoyance to perceive molecular and atomic particles. Microclairvoyance, a modern term, is one of the several supersentient faculties itemized in the very ancient Siddhi literature of the Indian subcontinent as knowledge of the small, the hidden, or the distant by directing the light of superphysical faculty. It is not at all that clear why the clairvoyant duo took an interest in micro-clairvoyance, but they set about working assiduously at this fabulous enterprise in order to clairvoyantly see and systematically describe the atomic and subatomic particles of all chemical substances. As might be expected, this effort consumed a number of years, but in 1908, the dynamic clairvoyant duo finally caused Theosophists to publish the results in a rather ponderous tome entitled Occult Chemistry, Clairvoyant Observations of the Chemical Elements. Most Theosophists then seem to have been completely bewildered by the voluminous book and its profusion of graphic illustrations of what molecular and atomic particles look like. Nonetheless, it was revised and added to in a second, even larger edition in 1919 by the two authors who had discovered more unknown micro-clairvoyant facts about chemical elements, and, after their deaths, it was enlarged in 1946 and again in 1951. The reason for the postmodern enlargements was most astonishing. After the invention of the electron microscope, first developed in Germany in 1932, it could begin to be seen that the clairvoyant drawings of Leadbeater and Besant of the atomic and subatomic particles of the elements corresponded almost exactly to what the electron microscope revealed. Additionally, the clairvoyants had illustrated some elements which, at the time, were not known to exist, but later were discovered and had correctly identified their atomic structures. In 1980, the American physicist Stephen M. Phillips, in exacting detail, pulled this entire story together in a book entitled Extrasensory Perception of Quarks. A quark being an elusive elemental particle whose existence was not even suspected until the 1960s. Had the clairvoyant duo of Leadbeater and Besant identified the structure of quarks? Yes, indeed, hence the name of Phillips' book. But they had identified practically everything right down to the spin and electromagnetic valences of the most elemental particles. How could two Theosophists, now long dead, identify chemical elements unknown to scientists of their day? Mused Phillips in two popular articles published in Fate magazine of April and May 1987. Needless to say, conventional physicists ran and are still running for the hills regarding this triumphant clairvoyant success, but for reasons decidedly obscure. It is perhaps equally meaningful, somehow, that this success caused not so much as a ripple in contemporary parapsychology, and which otherwise is always on the lookout for proof positive of any psi faculty. Due to the remarkable confirmations obtained after Leadbeater's death, there can be no doubt that this micro-clairvoyance was not only authentic, since it was authenticated, but also on the order of some unusual kind of magnitude. There is simply no other explanation. The human species may indeed possess rudimentary clairvoyant faculties, but the remarkable micro-clairvoyance of Leadbeater and Besant can arise only as a result of some kind of very controlled enhancement methods and processes. Unfortunately, what these enhancement methods consisted of have not yet been distilled out from the massive collections of theosophical documents. Sexualizing energy enhancement of clairvoyance. But there is one essential clue, at least in the case of Leadbeater. It is, however, a clue that no one, repeat, no one, will touch with a 10-foot pole. It resembles something like a forbidden meteoroid obliquely glancing off of Earth's atmosphere and heading back into the dark reaches of space. As it transpired, Leadbeater caused the Theosophical Society to be embroiled in, of all things, extraordinary and rather hilarious sex scandals, the nature of which are usually reduced to the lowest common and standard denominators of moralistic confusions. As it turned out, however, Leadbeater and Theosophy managed to survive these. As with the simple sex matters, it is exceedingly difficult to describe the central and entirely complex factors of the most major of those scandals. So, the better part of valor here is to attempt to describe what is involved as candidly as possible. It is quite clear that Leadbeater was interested in sexual energies and that he probably could clairvoyantly see them and their scintillating activities. His approach to these was probably organized around some kind of esoteric tantra exercises via which the sexual energies could be transmuted upwards, as it might be thought, to invigorate and activate or empower other more refined sentient energies that might respond to such triggering. In fact, there are rich traditions in antiquity regarding the communal ritualizing of this kind of thing to trigger catharsis somewhat along the lines experienced around Anton Mesmer's vats. But there is another important aspect involved. It was given extensive attention by Freud within the context he outlined for the libido defined in Webster's. Believe it or not, as emotional or psychic energy derived from primitive biological urges and usually goal-directed, i.e. sex drive. Sexually derived cathaxis. However, about 2,500 years before Freud, a quite similar but much more dignified concept existed in ancient Greece. Cathexis referred to the investment, emphasis added, of libidinal energy in a person, object, or idea. In the sense used in this definition, investment referred to an outer layer or envelope, and which, in terms of human energetics, places us in the proximity of the aura as the energy field that envelopes the physical aspects of the body. The cathexis concept, given name to a type of peak experiencing, also draws close to the modern concept that sexual energies can be transmuted into creative ones, albeit the nature of transmuting steps between the sexual and the creative energies remain conspicuously ambiguous and absent so far. Another way of putting this, as many have done, is to suggest that there are connections between sexual orgasm and so-called psychic orgasm. It is helpful, though, to clarify these types of orgasm as sex energy orgasm and psychic force orgasm. In any event, it is obvious that Leadbeater was attempting to opportune the transmutating investiture of productive cathexis by means historically remembered. This is to say, to do so via communal participatory ritualizing of the sexual energies. This, if successfully pulled off, is a little difficult to articulate, but the idea was that it would lift the sexual energies toward triggering the energetic empowerment of higher faculties, and within whose scope the faculties of super clairvoyance, super lucidity, etc. would be brought online. Here it can be mentioned that although Wilhelm Reich utilized different terms and concepts, his orgasm organ research led toward achieving cathexis much along the same line as Leadbeater's work. Now, considering the ultra-prudish, sex-freakish Victorian times involved, it might reasonably be expected that any format of all this, if publicly known, would undergo extensive censure. Leadbeater's method, though was certain to get him into deep kimchi or doo-doo, and so it transpired. As all achieved tantric experts do, Leadbeater distinguished between the qualities, functions, and powers of the female and male sex energies. Presumably because males and females have somewhat different energy equipment, waves, flows, frequencies, they each have different needs. Thus, there is a logic to the idea that the uplifting energies of the two sexes should be developed separately from each other. Leadbeater's charisma, there can be no doubt that he possessed high voltages of it, was such that he attracted a court of youngish males perpetually around him, and which never numbered less than 20 or so. Leadbeater was an early sex liberationist, indicating that full sexual experiencing within concomitance of guilt had an authentic place in life. Due to the prudery of the times, he covertly advocated the therapeutic advantages of masturbation, teaching it and the best ways of obtaining full therapeutic benefits from it. His court, however, had an inner circle of students, chelas, numbering about 6 or so, who were advanced in their studies. Hoping to achieve the cathexis investure of the higher energetic envelope, they all reposed in a circle and attempted to utilize synchronized masturbation to trigger the higher powers. This process required 2 important provisos, rather strenuous it would seem. That all involved were to time their physical ejaculations to the same precise moment, that the electrifying jolts of climaxing ecstasy experienced was by each participant to be lifted by deliberate attention and will above mere erotic enjoyment in the attempt to transmute that ecstasy upward so as to mutually energize the higher energy vehicles of all involved. The exacting simultaneous coordination among 6 or so young males required, of course, a lot of practice. But history had it that the Spartans had succeeded in this, thereby making them a force to be dealt with, as well as had various elements of ancient Persia, Babylon, Egypt, Macedonia, and, of course, ancient India, from which the exoteric and esoteric tantric formulas had emerged in the first place. When news of these activities gradually became more broadly known, the Theosophical Society was, of course, embroiled in rather sensational scandals. One vocal critic indicated that the society had been laid to ruin, and by one man. Leadbeater temporarily retired from the ruin and voyaged to Australia, where he developed an even stronger following, but eventually was received back into the society as a most honored elder brother. Those who have attempted to analyze this particular aspect of the elder brother's life have not coped with it very well, possibly because they were embarrassed by it. However, the analysts of Leadbeater were probably not well versed in tantric matters or in the history of sexual catharsis of ancient Greece and Egypt. With those historical factors in mind, it would have been clear that Leadbeater did not completely invent the methods, and that there was a more than adequate historical basis for them regarding therapeutic catharsis and metaphysical cathexis as established in antiquity. This historical basis revealed the existence of a power link between unobstructed sexual energies and unobstructed higher creative empowering functions, concepts of which infused the so-called mystery schools of antiquity. And here, it must be said, is a solitary clue as to why subsequent societies, including the modernist ones, which are not prepared to endorse widespread development of higher powers, have always felt it is necessary to erect layers of intolerance and confusion not only around higher powers, but around sexuality issues also. Put another way, that unobstructed sexual experiencing and realization can, under certain circumstances, lead to activation of the human faculties of high states of lucidity. Much of all this seems to have been incorporated into the astonishing persona of Charles Webster Leadbeater, and so it can be easily understood why, on the one hand, he represented several layers of societal threat, but why, on the other hand, he embodied a supermagnetic charisma somewhat impervious to various machinations of societal denting. Perhaps, as a last analysis, the micro-clairvoyant Leadbeater-Besant duo espied and illustrated in drawings the anatomy of chemical and atomic particles and the patterns of their energies before it became possible to do so by technically advanced methods. They identified several chemical atomic particles, the existence of which were only scientifically discovered decades later. 80 or so years after their book Occult Chemistry, several hundred pages in length, their percentage of error has turned out to be so small as to be negligible. At various points in his life, Leadbeater was very prolific in writing about fluidic vital energies of all kinds. Ultimately, these will in the future be compared to discoveries via advanced technologies of human energetic fields, otherwise once known as auras.